Well, I guess fear is not only the mind killer, it's a body killer too. Hello, interwebs, I hope you're all doing well, and welcome to my review of the Season 1 finale of Dune Prophecy, or Dune Prophecy if you've been following me for a while. And welcome to what will be, I think, my penultimate review in this space. If you're looking at the video right now, I am currently very clearly in a much more taken apart room than I have been. That's because I'm moving within the week. Yeah, I've been sort of taking everything apart. I do have one more review I'm going to be filming in here, Star Wars Skeleton Crew, later this week. But otherwise, I'm going to be out of this space, so apologies that it's not as nice looking. My cat is currently sitting on my lap here. If you want to take a look, he's just Kipo ended up and keeping me, his name's Kipo, and keeping me company. But for right now, you're just going to get this visual and the awareness that there's a cat just off screen for this review. I will have hopefully a better space in the coming few weeks. But let us get into this review. If you watched my review last week, my biggest concern for this finale was my worry that they weren't going to be able to wrap everything up. And my biggest concern with that was I was under the impression at the time that this was going to be a mini-series. Like, I hadn't really heard any talk of a season 2. This wasn't even, I didn't think, even referred to as a season 1. It was sort of referred to as just Dune Prophecy show. I hadn't heard any discussion of it going further. So I was really worried how they were going to wrap it up. Now, obviously, between last week and this week, we got a confirmation that it has been renewed for a season 2, which I as soon as I heard the news, I was like, okay, great. I think that'll give this finale a lot of space to allow it more room to breathe. And I think it really ended up helping this episode because while I do have some criticisms, I think this episode did a really good job of wrapping up a lot of the emotional arcs for this season and setting us up for some cool stuff next season. I think probably my biggest criticism overall, where sort of leaving on this episode before I get into my nitty gritty, is that this episode almost feels like it was just a lot of setup to get to a really much more interesting place for next season. Because where we leave this episode, we have some really cool power machinations and different pieces on the board and different factions sort of forming that I'm like, okay, I'm really curious to see how this is all going to build into next season. It almost makes me just wish we got to see some of that rather than just spending the 6 episodes building up to it. Now, that being said, some build-up can be useful and it can make for a really strong second season. So I didn't hate this season. I think it's and I think this finale is actually rather strong. Probably the best episode of the season, I think, overall. But I think it does make me sad that we only got 6 episodes. But again, I think wrapping it up the way they did was really good. I think the other element that I really like about this episode, before I get into talking some specifics, is that one of my other concerns was that a lot of the answers that they were going to give, especially if this was going to be the series finale, which it's not, was that a lot of the answers that they were going to give, like what the mysterious eyes that we were seeing or things like that, were going to be tied into larger Dune lore, that if you have read the books, you would know what it was, but if not, it would sort of be a kind of a vague mystery. As many of you know, I've read some of the books, not all of them. Definitely haven't read the Brian Herbert stuff or the later even Frank Herbert things. So I was sort of worried that the show would sort of point and nod at those things that it seemed to be hinting towards, like the God Emperor and things like that. But it wouldn't necessarily explain within this show. But it looks like the answers we get point more to a more immediate threats and machinations going on that may lead into larger stuff, but at least feels like they are more immediate in and able to be dealt with within the timeline scope of this series going into next season. So really, really liked that. But all that said, let us get into some of the specifics with all of this. First off, we have the confirmation of Desmond's powers, that he is sort of using a machine virus to infect people with fear, essentially, that kills them. Obviously, probably leading to the litany of fear that we're going to get with the Bene Gesserit sisters, the fear is the mind killer. I am glad we didn't get anyone saying fear is the mind killer in this episode. There was a point where when Tula is holding Valia, and Valia is sort of having her fear visions, I was wondering if Tula's going to say fear is the mind killer, and I was glad that they did not go that far. I'm kind of done and tired with on the nose sort of like nostalgia or even like just oblique references to things in TV shows. So I'm glad that they didn't go that far with it, but it does allude to it really rather well, and I think the build up to it was really good. We got the one sister, the healer sister, getting killed by it, and then Valia sort of facing off against Desmond and having her fear visions and her vision of her, her brother dying, and we get to see her biggest fear, that she's not good enough and not strong enough, and that she can't get through strength. She has to accept her fear, and I think that was a really good emotional arc for Valia, of like accepting her fear and not constantly fighting against it like she's been this whole season. And I think visually and emotionally that resonated rather well, and seems like it was a really good counteraction to Desmond's abilities in emotional arc as well. So love all of that. That was really strong. Speaking of Tula, though, I did really like her backstory of like her giving up Desmond, her going against her sister and keeping it from her sister, because she didn't trust her sister in that way, like protecting her son from her sister. And it's this interesting, again, rift between the two of them, considering that like they've had this trust, they've worked together, but obviously Valia's sort of been the lead and pushing her sister more and more and more to do things that she didn't want for the greater good. And the one thing that Tula did for herself, save her son, is coming back to bite them in the ass, but now she's saying trust her. And so I thought, again, that was a good arc for her and her reaching out to Desmond, and I'm curious to see where that's going to go next episode. And I said last week my biggest concern with the revelation that her son was Desmond was being like, well, she doesn't really have a relationship to Desmond within the show. Like, it would have been interesting if like she and Desmond had faced off or something before, and then she realized that he was her son. And that would have created a more interesting conflict. In actuality, I'll retract my statement on that, because it seems like they're setting up that relationship for next season, whereas the arc here was more focused on what the son meant for Tula and Valia's relationship, which was the much stronger sort of piece throughout this entire season that we've been seeing built, both in flashback and the present day, and the rift between those two, even though Valia sort of like been telling her sister what to do. So I think that actually that them not relying on Tula and Desmond having this sort of big set off at the end here, but just setting them up for next season, having that emotional core being on the sisters, I thought was a really, like, the biological sisters, the Bene Gesserit sisters, even though they are Bene Gesserit. You know what I meant. I think that was a really strong choice. But speaking of the Bene Gesserit sisters, we have Lila, I believe her name is, getting possessed by the former co-mother conspirator that was going to take over with Valia, that Valia killed. And the whole backstory on that was really visceral. Getting to see the two sisters forcing all of the other sisters to kill themselves, like choose, and they all choose to kill themselves, I thought was really visceral and really dark. And I thought like Lila literally draining the swamp and showing the bodies to everybody, to the sisters, I thought was a really visceral and cool setup. And at the end, leaves us in a place where it's like, okay, so we have Lila now possessed by Valia's former enemy, taking over the sisterhood to a large degree. And now Valia and Tula are on the back foot, not just from Desmond, but from their own sisterhood, is a fascinating place going into next season, especially considering Lila has a connection to Tula and Valia, both the possessed body and Valia as well. So like it's a really cool setup for next season. I'm really fascinated to see where that's going to go. As someone who has been sort of on and off on the younger sister storylines this season, present day younger sister storyline this season, I thought that was a really great twist and push for going into next season. Some of the other stuff we got here, it is a little bit weird that we only get a quick check-in with Harrow, who is clearly set up to betray his sister as well. So that's some interesting machinations going on there that I'll be curious to see going into next season. We don't get anything with Constantine here, who also seems to be set up for a greater setup for next season as well. Obviously, probably blaming the sisterhood for the death of his father, as we saw in this episode, because now one of the Mark Strong, the Carino's wife, sort of blames the sister for killing him, even though he took his own life. fascinating. Like, that's again a good setup for, like, okay, so now we got Constantine against the sisterhood. Desmond's kind of trying to reconcile maybe even with his own mother, so maybe he's drawn towards the sisterhood. The two sisters are against each other, and also Valia doesn't have grip on the sisterhood itself. So again, let's, like, really great. Like, Valia's in a really bad place politically right now, on all fronts, and I think that that's a really cool place for us to go into. Now, obviously, I think it's a little sad we're not getting much of Mark Strong anymore. I do really like him as an actor, but Carino, I think, was such a blah character. As much as I like Mark Strong as a presence, the character wasn't doing much for me, so I think killing him and setting up Constantine, who has had a much more, like, incel-y kind of arc, a grieved kid who, is not really, he doesn't have much of a backbone, wants to prove himself, sort of thing, fascist guy, probably a fascist arc leaning for him, I should say. I'm curious to see where that's going to go versus, again, his sister, who is now joined in with the Bene Gesserit along with the Atreides captain. So, again, some just good setup going on there. And the big revelation at the end of this episode is that someone has somehow got Desmond's body or made a Gola of his body and is using him for their own machinations. We don't know who or why yet. Again, I like this revelation because a lot of people were speculating, I saw, that the eyes that we were getting visions of were the God Emperor of Dune or the thinking machines or whatever. Some Brian Herbert stuff that I don't really know much about. But I like that in actuality it's much more of a immediate threat, that there's some group in the present day that is doing stuff that may be trying to lead to larger machinations in the future, but it is a more immediate threat. So appreciated that. I will say the one visual of the, like, getting to see the eye come out from its own, like, the first person view of that, kind of wild. That was creepy as all hell, and I liked it a lot. I thought that was that was memorable, and I appreciated that. So very cool sequence there. I'm trying to think if there was anything else. Like I said, as we wrap up this episode, I thought this was a solid finale, but it does leave me thinking, like, yeah, this feels like just a lot of setup for next season. While we get some good emotional resolution, mainly between Julia and Valia and their sort of arc going between the two of them, I think at the end of the day, this just sets us up in a really cool place for next season with Valia on the extreme back foot as she heads off to Arrakis. So, and we obviously get the promise of Arrakis next season. So, yeah, I think this was a solid finale, but one that has me much more excited for season 2. It makes me look back at this entirety of season 1 being like, this feels like a big setup for a season 2. And I almost wish I had known that going in, because it might have made me appreciate it a little bit more as I was watching. But as I sit here now, I'm like, okay, well, this puts a lot of weight on season 2 to really pay off a lot of this time that we've invested into this series. But as it stands, it has me excited for that next season. So yeah, Dune Prophecy Season 1, I think a solid show, had its ups and downs, but really I think found its footing a little bit and has to now pay it off whenever we get back to it next year or however long it takes in the streaming era for TV shows to come back nowadays. This is an aside. That's my one biggest damn gripe. Actually, I have many gripes with the streaming era. Let me rephrase. A lot of gripes with the streaming era. One of them being that it takes for damn ever to get new seasons of shows. Like, we used to get 20 episodes of TV shows every year. 20 episodes every single year. And while that had its own problems, for sure, not saying it didn't, we've seemed to have gone the complete roundabout way where it's like now we get 6 to 8 episodes every 2 years, which is wild and frustrating because it's like, I want people to take the time that they need to make their story great. But sometimes we don't even get a great story for the amount of time we've had to wait between seasons for many different projects, not just Dune Prophecy. Regardless, that is a larger discussion for another day, but I will leave it here. With that said, thank you for watching my penultimate review from this room. Say goodbye to my Kipo. Say goodbye to the people, Kipo. Yeah, he's just chilling. But with that, I will bid you all a live long and prosper, my friends.